Right, so these are what people are writing about. So this is the percentage of articles in The Guardian that have a reference to happiness. You can see that's doubled in the last 7 years. And mental health, which has increased by a factor of 5. I mean, this is extraordinary. These sort of changes don't usually happen in terms of what the public is interested in. What are academics interested in? Another extraordinary change. So there's a number of articles published on happiness or well-being, subjective well-being, in academic journals. In all journals, it's now up to 2,000 a year. And in economics even, economics journals, it's up to 300 a year, which is really quite remarkable. That's a huge change. But of course, as I said before, I think the things which are changing most are what individuals are up to. What are they looking for? Well, here is what they're searching for on Google. Meditation, up by a factor of 66%. Yoga, similarly. And doubtless other things if we could include them. So my perception of what is going on in that happiness revolution is that individuals are leading. They are reconsidering what their priorities are, more and more of them, not enough, of course. And as usual, the policymakers come behind the individuals. So I thought I would talk about policymakers, mainly here. So what do we want policymakers to do? Whoops, now I need to find out how to go back. They've got a certain pot of money, and I'm talking about policymakers at every level, from central government, local, NGOs, anybody who's got a pot of money should be spending it to produce the greatest amount of happiness that they could from that amount of money. So how would they do that? In 2 stages. I mean, first they would have to think in what areas broad areas they would consider spending the money. And that would mean that they would have to have some understanding about what are the factors which make the most difference to people's happiness. And then they would have to know what within the chosen areas was feasible, what was actually going to make a difference, and what would it cost, and what would be the most cost-effective way to raise happiness in the area that they were thinking of targeting. And it's quite obvious that this is where our knowledge is terribly deficient, and we need, and this should be central to all social science, just thousands of proper controlled trials, exactly as they do in medicine, of interventions, policies to increase happiness in every area that you can possibly think of. So let me take those in that order. Let me talk first very quickly about what matters most, and then a bit about how we would do cost-benefit analysis. So I'm going to say a bit more than Paul did about what we found in our analysis in the origins of happiness. So there are I'm going to show you 3 steps. First step is, here are people as adults. What of their current circumstances is most important in affecting their happiness? Then take them at the end of their childhood and say, what of the things that we know about them at the end of childhood best predict how happy their adult lives will be? And then finally go back to what in the whole of their life up to the end of childhood most improves their well-being. Right, so oops. This is strange. Sorry, this is not the whole graph. I don't know what's happened here. Some of the words have disappeared. Well, I know what the words are. The first missing word is income. So income is the factor, but as you know, it's not the main factor affecting people's happiness. Education isn't either. The next is unemployment, a very important factor, but of course there are not that many unemployed people, so it doesn't explain that much of the variation. Quality of work, incredibly important. Whether you've got a partner, the next missing one, Then whether you're engaged in criminal society and excluded by that, then your physical health, and then your mental health. So basically, the big picture is that what matters is health, especially mental health, and human relationships at work, or in the family or in the community. And these are the things that should now be the targets for policymakers, because, as I'll argue, we know quite a lot about how to handle those, which we used not to. But let's go back, because obviously some of these current circumstances are the product of childhood. So what in childhood best predicts whether the person will have a satisfactory life after that as an adult? And not surprisingly, of course, it's not their qualifications, it's their emotional well-being at 16. I'm so sorry I didn't check these. Well, perhaps I did. Let me just see if this is my fault. Now this is something odd is happening here. Anyway, there we go. So, not qualifications, it's emotional health at 16. Just one measure predicts more about whether you'll have a good life than everything about your qualifications, even right up to your PhD. And the third, smaller one is good behavior at 16. So the last slide I'm going to show you is what determines your emotional health at 16. This is a comparison between, using the ALSPAC data, the effect of all observed characteristics of your parents, that's what observed is, with simply which primary school you were at or which secondary school you were at. And it is completely extraordinary. People often say schools don't make much difference to the happiness of children. Well, it's all down to parents. It's not. Schools can have an enormous effect. So if we're thinking about policy areas, we have to think about schools. Schools should teach life skills as well as how to earn a living. We obviously have to think about how to help people have good family lives, good work experience, and good community environment. And above all, help them if they fall into problems with mental health especially. So that's the sort of finding the right areas. And I think that the conclusion of that is this, that we need a new concept of deprivation. And it really upsets me that after we've been at this for some years, people still assume deprivation is the same as poverty. I can tell you that that slide that I showed you for what affects the variation of life satisfaction is exactly the same. The weights are exactly the same. If you ask the separate question, what affects whether somebody is at the bottom end of the happiness scale? Income is not the main factor. Mental health, family problems, work problems are nearer in size to being important than poverty. So we absolutely need to din into our politicians a new concept of deprivation, unhappy for whatever reason. And the other thing is that I think it is right that these are the problems we spend most of the extra money that we've got, or marginal money, on, because it is much easier to raise, and this comes out of almost every study where there's a universal intervention. The people who start at the bottom gain more than the people who start at the top. So it's easier to help the people at the bottom. And of course, they are the people who are generating further costs down the line that can be saved by helping them. So what I'm trying to say to political parties is that there are areas here which don't cost a lot, but will make a huge difference. And this should be the main area for policy innovation. But of course it involves a different role for the state. Some people call it the nanny state, but it isn't. We're helping people to help themselves. The state started off doing very little. bit by bit, it took on the role of helping people to be good workers. I mean, that was revolutionary. And now, shouldn't it take on the role of helping them to be good at other aspects of life, like human relationships and mental health? Of course it should. So this is the coming margin for state activity. So how is it to be done? How is this analysis to be done? Well, we obviously need a new form of policy analysis where the benefit is measured in units of well-being or happiness. And this is becoming a practical possibility, and policies obviously should be judged by their impact on the collective happiness per pound spent. But it's not the pound spent initially, it's the pound spent minus the savings generated. That's really important. So I'll just give you a sort of example here. This is an imaginary example, though I hope it might turn out to be true. Suppose we taught life skills weekly for 4 years using the existing PSHE slot, but with better materials and better training of teachers. The cost per class, let's assume, was about £20,000. Let's assume there are cost savings because of less criminality, less use of the National Health Service and so on, of 10,000, and the benefit is, let's say, a very small amount. I want to stress this. The benefits of almost anything we know, maybe this came out earlier today, the benefits of most interventions are very small. That doesn't mean they don't matter, because if they affect a lot of people and they don't cost too much, that is the way forward. And this is a really important point. Don't be put off by small numbers, and don't accept that an effect size of 0.2 is small. It's not. It's really important. So suppose this was 0.3 units of life satisfaction on a scale 0 to 10, which is an effect size of 0.15. These are the sort of numbers you probably get from this sort of intervention. But affecting 33 children for, say, 5 years, you can see that that is going to give you 50 life satisfaction point years as a benefit from the 10,000 net cost, and a sort of sensible cutoff that you might want to be comparing it with is something, this is a bit like the NHS quality cutoff, something like 10 units of life satisfaction on a scale 0 to 10 for every 10,000 pounds. So this is just to whet your appetite. This is how I hope that all of you who are doing this interesting work on these interventions will look at your results. So finally, what's the chance of this happening? Is this going to happen? Well, the OECD Secretary General got the agreement of his member countries to say that the objective of OECD member states should be the well-being of their people. He didn't say subjective well-being, but he did say well-being, which is a great shift forward from the economic growth as the only target. Great improvement. And of course, the OECD has got every country to measure the well-being of its people. But who is actually looking at policy this way? Well, we've made some advances in how the UK Green Book thinks about this. The phrase at the front, paragraph 2, is that the aim of public policy is social well-being. That's quite something. But of course, how do you evaluate it? Well, you could evaluate by willingness to pay, and that is going to go on, and quite rightly. It's often the most efficient way of getting at well-being. But for the majority of public expenditure, you can't use willingness to pay. It doesn't make sense in health, law and order, environment, and so on. you've got to have some direct measure of well-being. And the Green Book does have a couple of pages where it encourages people where you can't use willingness to pay to measure well-being directly, as the What Works Centre is doing. So that's a step forward. But perhaps the countries that have got furthest forward are these four that I put down here. They are all mandated to look at all policies, legally mandated, look at all policies in terms of their impact on subjective well-being. In the case of France and Sweden, it doesn't say that's the only criterion, but it says you've got to do it. In the case of UAE and Bhutan, it says that that is the only criterion. And if a policy is proposed to the cabinets in either of those countries, it has to come in with a recommendation that shows that it passes the impact on happiness test. So that's great, but they're small countries. But I believe that more and more countries will come this way. How will it happen? It will happen because of popular demand, of course. It's not going to happen because politicians decide it. It's going to happen because the people say that it's a silly policy to be, for example, building all this physical infrastructure. Think of the cost of HS2. And why aren't we building human infrastructure, which costs peanuts compared with HS2? We're actually dismantling our human infrastructure in parts at the moment, as you know. Our youth services, child mental health, all these things are being cut down, and we're talking about, oh, but the great thing to do, of course, with extra money, is physical infrastructure. It's a kind of madness of perspective. And I think the public will end up demanding that they get help with the problems facing them in their lives, which are problems of mental health, problems of family conflict, problems of loneliness. These are the central problems which are cheap to deal with, and I think that they will become the priorities for the next lot of money, I hope. But more generally, I think the world is moving to take this seriously. I think in 25 years' time, this is the way that policy will be made in most of our countries, and I think it will make for a better world. Thank you.